get interest groups? How do they form and how do they actually stay in business? Because that's a very important question. We've got a large universe of interest groups in the United States, and seemingly there are so many interest groups that it's almost impossible to realize how they would actually stay in business, particularly when they deal with the same kind of topics. At another section of the course, we'll talk about these different types of what we would call ecologies, but for right now, let's just talk about how these groups form. We're going to rely on some scholarship by a political scientist named Anthony Nouns, and coming from his book, Interest Groups in American Politics, Pressure and Power. This is a chapter called The Formation and Maintenance of Interest Groups. So we'll examine exactly what it is that he's taking a look at here. Basically, he says, in the U.S., some interests are better represented by interest groups than others, right? And it's very important to basically just step back for a second and say that we may be a group of people that have a common interest, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we actually have the ability or do mobilize in order to be able to take our issues to those people who are in decision-making capabilities at some level of government. So the example that I like to use with my undergraduate students is that we have what we like to call a super PAC, talking about the cost of higher education. And while a lot of students are obviously very interested in amount of student loan debt that they have, the fact that they might have to work to go to college, ways to make college more affordable, just because you are interested in those topics doesn't necessarily mean that you have an interest group that represents you. So the question is, for Nouns, how is it that we have all these interests out there and you transfer from just being an interest to becoming an actual interest group? And there are a lot of problems associated with this. So that's what Nouns wants to take a look at in this chapter as we read, and we'll go through here a little bit. So he says, there are a couple of things that we should look at when examining why some interests are more represented than others. One is the barriers to interest group formation and survival. The second is how interest groups overcome barriers to formation and survival. And then why barriers result in unequal interest representation. So those are the three things that we're going to take a look at in this section of the course. So first of all, he talks about two things, formation and survival. Really wants to kind of define these terms so that we understand them, because for different interests, formation and survival can mean different things, because there's a whole variety of types of people that like to lobby. So he defines as formation as the point at which that organization becomes politically active, right? Now think about this. There are different types of organizations out there. If you, for example, are part of, let's just say what we typically call an interest group, maybe the American Association of Retired Persons or the National Rifle Association, which are two kind of examples that Nouns uses here. There's an actual fixed date point at which those groups became organizations to lobby on behalf of older Americans and to lobby on behalf of Second Amendment gun rights, right? So we can point to an actual date that they were formed. Now, for a lot of other people, particularly what we would call institutions, there is no fixed date point at which they kind of came into being. So for example, Widener University, which has its own government relations department, came into being in 1821. But that's not actually the date that we became politically active. The date that we became politically active was the first time the president of the university decided to try to advocate to a member of Congress, first time we got a government relations office, the first time we hired a contract lobbyist, that sort of thing, right? So you can take two separate vantage points here. One is those kind of interest groups that we typically call, usually are founded on a specific date, whereby a lot of institutions, and in many of the cases for students here, nonprofit organizations, at some point get mobilized to kind of go and do something. That's their date of formation. Now the second thing is the idea of survival. And again, just taking these examples of interest groups versus kind of institutions, interest groups basically, their survival depends on whether or not they can stay in business day to day, right? Or are we just going to go out of business and stop lobbying, right? It's unimaginable, but maybe at some point the American Association of Retired Persons all of a sudden no longer has any membership, they can no longer function, and they no longer become a viable concern, and they go out of business. It's not quite the same for institutions. So for example, again, there may come some point in time when a nonprofit organization, or again using the example of Widener University, where we would decide that we no longer can afford to have a government relations officer, and we no longer can kind of dedicate resources towards trying to influence our public policymakers on issues of higher education. And at that point, we would no longer be considered to be surviving as a pressure group, right? But that doesn't mean that Widener University goes out of business. It just means that we no longer advocate, right? So Nouns really wants to kind of clarify these definitions before he gets into a greater discussion about these things. So what are the kind of barriers to interest group formation and survival? And Nouns relies fairly heavily here on Mansur Olson, which we'll talk about in a minute, and adds a couple of other things. So he says there are three basic barriers to us creating an interest group and keeping it alive. And that is cost, what we would call free riders, and then what we could call the concept of political efficacy. So if you think about it, cost is really kind of probably the number one thing that affects the ability to be able to keep an interest group up and running. So, you have to think about this. We got to form an organization, right? Typically involves having employees, typically involves having some kind of physical structure that we work out of. In some cases, it may mean having a building in Washington, D.C. or Harrisburg in addition to someplace else. So that causes a lot of need for initial capital that's difficult to come by. Second of all, you need to continue to stay in business by funding the ongoing operations of that organization. So you have to spend time and effort and money trying to recruit money for that. Then finally, beyond just money, thinking about the idea of time and effort to keep these organizations going. And sometimes that can be done via volunteers, sometimes it can be done via paid staff, and oftentimes it's done by a combination of the two. But there's a lot of cost associated with that as far as time's concerned, right? So you got to organize meetings, you have to put together a board that will come to those meetings, you have to keep membership that can come to meetings, you have to recruit those new members and hopefully get them to pay dues so you can keep your organization going. You have to seek outside funding above and beyond just kind of recruiting new members. You have to have events and organize them and hold them to bring in new members and to publicize your interests. All of this stuff costs money. And if they're volunteers, rational human beings like to spend their time doing other things besides working, nonstop outside of their other jobs. If you have people that actually are getting paid to do this kind of stuff, obviously there's a cost involved with that and the ongoing operation of the interest group. So cost is a big barrier to being able to organize, to go from being just a group of people that are concerned about something to actually being a group that advocates for something. Now, here's where the interesting stuff comes in. So Mansur Olson wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action. And basically says, you know what? We have these things called collective goods. And collective goods are something that benefit everybody, right? So think of a collective good as being something like, say, for example, clean air. So if the government spends money on clean air or clean water, that's not something that just one or two people benefit from. Everybody that happens to breathe that air is in fact benefiting from that. So it's a collective benefit. As opposed to, say, a tax break for one specific type of company is a very selective benefit. It benefits a small amount of people. Now, if everybody benefits for somebody, it's not really rational for us really to contribute to that cause. Now, I would doubt, if we sit around and think about this, that many of us are opposed to clean air or opposed to clean water. But very few of us will donate money to that or to that cause to keep those organizations going. Why? It's not rational. Somebody else will take care of it, right? So from Olson's vantage point, we never really get organizations that are going to function for the collective good because people won't fund those organizations. Why? Because we're a bunch of free riders, right? So think about this. NPR, PBS, my favorite examples of this, right? So, a couple times a year they have, if you particularly in Philadelphia listen to WHYY, they'll have their pledge drives, right? And some people go about, they give their $120 or $60 a year in order to be able to keep this going. Kind of think of it a little bit like, well, it's kind of like HBO, but it's for the mind instead, and I'll pay $12 a month to be able to have, NPR on, that sort of thing. And then you have other people who are free riders, Give you an example. My brother-in-law is always like, well, why should I have to pay for that? Somebody else will pay for it. Don't worry about it, right? That's being a free rider. Basically saying, you know what? NPR has been on for decades, right? They have these little phonophons all the time, but they still stay in business. I never give them any money. They'll stay in business without me. They don't need me. And I'll get the service for nothing, right? That's being a free rider. Right? So that creates what we call a collective action problem. When rational, self-interested people free ride, right, rather than help providing for a collective good that we would all like. So one of the problems then becomes is unless you get some specifically defined benefit out of an interest group that benefits you directly and not other people, it's going to be very difficult to be able to form an interest group. And then finally, and this is directly related, this is another one of Olson's kind of theories, is that there's what we can call a political efficacy problem. And by efficacy, we mean the ability to be able to actually affect what government does and to be effective in our interest group lobbying and advocacy. So there's the feeling that, amidst these big budgets, say for example, a $100 million budget for a large interest group, my $25 isn't going to make any difference, so why should I bother becoming a member of that, right? One person can't make much of a difference. So when you think about that, that makes it more difficult for these organizations to be able to maintain themselves once that they've started, right? So everything's aligned against those organizations that are out there that are trying to do something for the collective good for a lot of different types of people, right? Now, how do we then actually get any interest groups? If we just look at Olson, we'd basically say that there isn't going to be anybody out there supporting any type of issues other than those that are kind of discrete issues that help individuals that are interested in tax breaks and so forth. Well, basically he says there are three things. Organizations provide selective benefits. They can coerce people to join so that they have to get the dues. And they can rely on what we can call patrons. All right? So let's take a look here real quickly at selective benefits. Now, what we mean by selective benefit is how do I get somebody to join an organization that's not rational for them to join? I give them stuff, right? Think about this. So I join WHYY and I get a WHYY umbrella or coffee mug or some other thing, some invitation to go to some event that WHYY runs. That's an incentive, a material benefit for me to join that organization, right? So material benefits are stuff that we get. So to give you an example, a lot of organizations, and here's two, again, of the big ones that Nouns talks about here. A lot of these really big organizations, the political advocacy isn't necessarily all that important for them. So AARP basically focuses in on issues related to older people, typically Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of stuff. But they provide a lot of selective benefits that really get people to pony up their $25 or whatever it is a year. I love this cover, Dr. Dre. Pretty edgy for AARP, huh? So let's take a look at AARP real quickly, right? So there's all kinds of information on their website above and beyond, just things about advocating for Social Security cuts. They have their own magazine, they have their own kind of various articles that they write here. But the one thing that's important here is, and what probably most people join is, discounts and benefits. All right, so let's take a look at what they got. So they got travel deals, savings, auto insurance, life insurance, discounts at Outback Steakhouse, cinemas, grocery coupons, other discounts. And then you get the little AARP card that allows you to get all the blue plate specials when you're down in Florida, right? So there are all kinds of these selective benefits that come along with being an AARP member. And many people join AARP not really because they care about their advocacy efforts, but because they get all this stuff. And the more members you have, the more that the AARP can go to Congress and say, we've got X number of million members. Most of those people don't really even care, right, about what they're advocating for. Now, the National Rifle Association is a bit different. People that, and Nouns talks a bit about this. So, there is a lot of political advocacy here when it comes to the NRA, and that's why a reason why a lot of people join this organization. So you can see here, Wayne LaPierre and Donald Trump. But there's a lot of other information on here as well. So there's a store, you get some publications, they have various things where they have gun safety programs, programs to teach children how to hunt, that kind of stuff. And then they've got their own shop, you get your little sticker with your NRA lifetime membership and so forth. So these are the kind of selective benefits that are material benefits that people get from joining these organizations. There's also what we can call solidary benefits and expressive benefits. And basically, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but it's basically the idea that, you're hanging out with people that think like you go to events with other people, you volunteer, maybe you're stuffing envelopes, maybe you're making some phone calls to advocates, and you're working with those people that are like you, and you enjoy being with those people, and also you get a good feeling of kind of this intangible goodwill that you're doing something good, right? So those benefits then kind of manipulate people into joining the organizations, which it's not rational under Olson's theory for them to do otherwise. Another way that you can get people to join is by coercing them. So, for example, this is a very complicated thing, but corporations in general are not allowed to give money directly to candidates running for federal offices. So, state laws differ by state. So we have something called a political action committee, and that political action committee, let's just say it might be the Comcast PAC, right? Can't be funded by Comcast itself, but guess who provides the funding for that political action committee? Employees of Comcast, right? And so in many respects, people were kind of coerced as employees of Comcast, and we're not talking about, people that are coming in, hooking up your cable. We're talking about the executives at the highest level to give the maximum amount to those political action committees. So you're kind of coercing them to join the political action committee on behalf of Comcast. Another example is labor unions. So in some states there are these things called right-to-work laws where you can work somewhere where collective benefits have been organized by a labor union, but you don't actually have to participate in that union. But there are 28 states that don't have right-to-work laws, and in those states you can be forced essentially to join the union because they've negotiated on your behalf for collective bargaining costs. So that money then goes to the union. So a couple ways you could coerce people to joining. And then finally, a lot of organizations, particularly in the 60s and 70s, were basically, because of this idea of collective action problem, a lot of private foundations started to step up and give money to organize groups that would not otherwise have been organized. So traditionally, groups like the Ford Foundation have funded liberal organizations, and groups like the Bradley Foundation have supported conservative groups. And you can check a couple of the examples that are provided by Nouns in the book. And then finally, wealthy individual patrons, right? So a guy named Tom Stiers from California, and he's very much into the environment. He's been kind of funding all these types of groups getting political action going in recent years in relationship to the environment around the country. The Koch brothers, right? You hear them for conservative causes. George Soros for liberal causes. So if you can get somebody that opens up their wallet, that's a good way to be able to kind of fund your organization and keeping it going. Now, the final thing that we see here is, why is it that we have unequal interest group representation, right? So one of the things is what Nouns talks about as being the dominance of institutions, right? So it's easier for something that already exists to become politically active than it is to create your own new group, right? So think about that. If I'm already an organization, let's say a business, I don't have the free rider problem, right? Because I don't have to get money to have people contribute. I've already got a source of income to come in. I don't have to worry about political efficacy. The only thing I'm really worried about is cost. But a lot of institutions, particularly those that are businesses, have a fair amount of capital at their own dispensary. So they are able to fund these organizations. Now, it's much more difficult to get a new interest group up and running because you have those barriers that we've already talked about. So the dominance of institutions, think about this, businesses are much more likely to be able to organize than consumers, right? Nouns gives a very good example. You're much more likely to see, say for example, an individual college or university. So for example, Widener's Government Relations Department also has in the past worked with contract lobbyists in Washington. You're much more likely to see Widener lobby on behalf of something than you would be to have individual students from Widener go and lobby. Why? Because they got no money, right? Or for example, teachers or professors or instructors here at Widener are much less likely to lobby than the university. One, because we don't have a union, but two, because again, the cost barrier and all the other barriers associated with that. Right? So institutions are more likely to have representation than are just those regular institution groups. Another thing is that affluent people are more likely to be joining interest groups. Right? If you have more disposable income, it's more likely that you'd be willing to join an interest group. Right? So Nouns provides a bunch of examples, which I'll let you take a look at, that show basically that the overwhelming amount of money that goes into interest groups comes from people that are above average wealth. Right? Now, the problem with that, obviously, is that that might mean that there are certain types of people in society that are not represented because they are poor, they don't have the political or social capital to be able to organize their interest groups, and that means that some people are not represented. The second thing is kind of people with intense interest tend to feel the need to join organizations, right? So if you believe that something is a great moral problem or a great constitutional right or is somehow holding people back in society from achieving who they want to be, and from your standpoint that's the most important issue in society, you're much more likely to say, I'm going to give my $25 to this organization because it's such an important problem, right? So intensity of interest overcomes that free rider problem. Right? So if you've got an issue that is enormously kind of controversial in society and people believe that their rights are being threatened, at that point in time, they're willing to give money. And that's why you really see a lot of kind of emails or mailers that you get are always trying to drum up the idea that we're at the point of Armageddon, where if you don't give your $25 right now, every one of our constitutional rights is going to be taken away. And this is not something that's just happened in the last couple of years. This has been going on for 25, 30 years. And then finally, some organizations are more likely to be able to organize because they have good leadership. And I'm going to point you really towards a real nice case study that Nouns uses in this chapter. And he uses the idea of Cesar Chavez, who was the United Farm Workers. Now, here's a group of people that obviously should not probably have very much representation because they're poor, and migrant workers particularly do not have, would not expect them to have very much representation in the political spectrum. But Chavez's ability to be able to organize people and get funding and be a charismatic leader really helped kind of the United Farm Workers become the voice of these farm workers, particularly in California, and spreading out after that. So good leadership is a very important thing, but the problem is when you're talking about the maintenance of an organization. Now, you can have good organization to get it started, and it can go on for a couple of years just on the basis of good leadership, but once that leadership steps down, you're no longer guaranteed that the maintenance of that organization will continue. So they have to build kind of an institution that can continue without them, but good leadership is very important.